Hello everybody and welcome to Chop Props. It's the first episode here, so there's probably going to be a lot of mess ups. Worked in the electronics industry for about 10 years, making controllers for silicon wafer fabrication. That included through-hole soldering, soldering wires, making connectors, testing all those connectors, and other types of things like that. So when I started looking at YouTube videos online, noticed that some people were either really afraid of soldering, didn't know how to solder correctly, or just, cringeworthy stuff. So what I decided I'd do is make some videos that describe a little bit better on how to solder, how to make your connections good, probably do an episode on strain relief, and just give you a little bit more information about soldering. So let's begin. Okay, we're going to begin by describing some of the tools for soldering. Let me move the camera here a little bit. One thing everybody's probably heard of are strippers. Wire strippers. Not the other kind of strippers. These are probably one of the most common ones that people use for stripping. These are okay. There are the different holes for the different gauges, or AUG. All this other stuff you really don't need to worry about. These are crimpers for insulation, but I'll show you a better way to crimp things once we get to that section. And these are typically cutters for screws, so you can screw a screw in and cut screws. So these multi-tools are kind of nice. These are the most common ones I used when I was working. And then also, I'll show a picture of it, but alright, good steepers. You can see that with one squeeze of the handle, the little choppers at the bottom would actually cut into the insulation. And then on the other side of those choppers, you can see that it has a little press fixture that actually puts pressure down on the wires. And then what happens is it splits down the middle, and it actually pulls the wire away from the cutter, and actually and does the cutting and pulling away in one fell swoop. So if you're doing a lot of wires, I suggest that you get that type of wire stripper, because it works really well. And there's my cursor. Other things you'll probably need are things to hold wiring. So I really suggest that you get yourself a pair of needle nose pliers, or like these angled needle nose pliers. They're very neat. They're very good for holding wires together, or holding a wire to something that you're soldering, that kind of thing. Also, I have this vise. It's a clamping vise. Basically, you can clamp it to the table, and then it's got this nice rubberized surface here. Put your wires in there that you're going to solder, and clamp it down nicely without damaging any of the shielding or the wiring. You've probably seen other people also use things like the blue tack clay or clay. That works too. They just put a couple of dots of clay on something, and then put the wires on the clay, and then solder the wires, and then put the wires on the clay, and then solder the wires. Also, some people use those clamps. They're kind of like, they look like Dr. Octopus, and they're like movable, and they have little clamps at the ends that you can clamp wires and then position the wires where you want to solder them. The reason why you want to match the gauge to the hole is because you want to strip away the outer coating of the wire and not damage any of the wire underneath. Because if you damage any of the wire underneath, you could not have a solid connection, or if it strips too much, you may have only 2 or 3 wires left of a multi-conductor wire. And that brings up another point. If you look at the far left, you'll see that there's wires that have a single core, and there's wires that have multi-conductor. The most common you'll see is multi-conductor wiring. That's what they use to wire, like, headphone jacks, power cords, that kind of thing. Don't worry about the solid core wire for now. You'll probably be using mostly multi-conductor wire. Anywhere between 22 gauge up to maybe 12 gauge. If you look on the lower right panel, the anything like 8 AUG, 6 AUG, 2 AUG, 0 AUG. AUG and gauge are almost interchangeable. There's negligible difference between the use of AUG and the use of gauge. But like 0 AUG, 00 AUG, you're not really going to use that type of stuff unless you're pulling super high amperage on, say, like a car amplifier or car headlights or something like that. So stuff you'll be dealing with is a lot higher AUG, which means a smaller wire. So remember, the higher the number, the smaller the wire. Let's go to clippers. These are flush cut clippers. Not really necessary for doing wire stripping, but they are good to have as being able to clip things flush to a board. And then these larger ones are called dikes. These are for cutting through heavier wire, which you probably won't need to do. But two different types of clippers and dikes. There is also heat shrink and tape, electrical tape. This one's a little dirty. Don't look. That's cleaner. All right. So everybody's seen this black electrical tape, kind of sticky. I use it in very specific locations, only because when it gets older, the adhesive tends to not stick to this plastic backing, and it starts to come apart, especially with heat and moisture. So for cosplaying, not much, because the body heat and sweat are going to make this stuff really, really nasty. Not to mention, anything that it sticks to is going to leave this adhesive behind and just be really sticky and annoying. So what I prefer is more heat shrink, and I suggest everybody get a nice collection of heat shrink when I start soldering. As you can see, it comes in different sizes. Super tiny, really big. Another thing you're going to want to get is one of these guys, or a fan. This is a little more fancier. It actually filters the air, but solder is going to put off a lot of hazardous chemicals. So what you want is some kind of fan to push out the air, or pull the air away from you, or filter the air, and something that you can get relatively close to the piece that you're working on, because you will, in the later videos, you will see you will put off a lot of hazardous smoke and that kind of thing. So either be in a well ventilated area, or have some sort of fan or filter running next to the whatever you're soldering, so that you don't suck in the hazardous materials. Another tool we have here is the soldering iron. So, seen a lot of people use wood pens or other things that heat up very hot as soldering irons. Try and get a little more inexpensive version of a soldering iron that you can actually control the heat. So the reason why you need higher temperatures is because you actually have to heat the two pieces of metal that you're soldering together, and then the solder will flow in between them. So solder actually melts very, 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 very low temperature. And so being able to control how hot you can make your iron will let you be able to solder different materials. Like I've seen people solder the train track pieces. So they put the two train track pieces together, and then there's a mating piece that you solder. So, but there's plastic road ties underneath, right around it. So you can actually dial down the temperature a little bit to be able to have a little more control of being able to solder something without melting things that are underneath it. So for beginner soldering, I mean, you could get just a basic soldering iron when you're starting out. But if you start soldering more and more things other than wires, I would suggest getting one that has a temperature control on it. So another reason to use a soldering iron instead of like a wood pen or something like that. Soldering irons have a lot of different types of tips. One thing you'll need to do is tin these tips once you have a brand new solder, and I'll cover that in the soldering video. But basically, having a soldering iron gives you a wide range of different types of tips. So not only for soldering. If you ever watch foam smithing YouTube channels like Punish Props or Evil Ted, sometimes they like to use a soldering iron to, make lines and things like that, or cuts into foam. So having a soldering iron allows you to have a wide variety of tips that you can use with your iron. As you can see with your standard soldering iron, there's a lot of different types with different types of tips made of different materials. All of these, of course, are going to be relevant to the type of soldering that you're going to be doing. The one with the black handle here in the middle is probably one of the most common. It's got a small tip, but for a beginning person soldering, and if you're doing just wire, I think one of these types of soldering irons would do just fine. Alright, our next tool is probably one of the most important tools. Solder. Solder comes in many different types. They also have a number. This number is 6040, and in this case, the 60 represents the amount of tin by weight compared to the amount of lead, which is the 40 by weight. 6040 is probably the most common that you'll find for electronic soldering. There are different types of solders, different sizes of solders, and the types of solders that you use for, say, home pipes or copper, things like that, are going to have very, very little lead, like 0.4% lead, that kind of stuff. Will have some lead in it because it needs it in order to have the reaction that you need. But you're probably going to be working most likely with this 6040 rosin core, or if you're soldering pieces of metal together, you'll want to use a different type of solder because they'll be a lot stronger. Since there's a considerable amount of lead in this, you wouldn't want to use this to, say, solder two pieces of metal together and have any kind of strength to them. This type of solder is specifically used for like electronics and wiring, which is the stuff that we'll use. We might get into other types of soldering later, but for this series right now, we're just going to stick with electronics. So you've probably also seen people have a jar of flux or resin, and they dip it in and then spread it over the electronics that they're going to solder together. I personally have never used that in an electronics soldering application because a lot of the solders nowadays have a rosin core, which means the rosin is actually inside the core of this wire. When you're choosing the size of solder, you want to choose a smaller size of solder rather than a large one, especially if it's a rosin core, because the larger solder is going to have less rosin per square inch than the smaller. So rosin is basically the material that conditions the metal to receive the solder. And when we start doing solder in the later episodes, you'll see what I'm talking about. But basically, rosin is good. Rosin is good. Rosin is good. So I hope you learned a little bit in this video. Some of the tools that are used for soldering. We didn't cover all the tools, of course, because you're not going to be using a lot of tools when you're soldering for cosplay and things like that. But these are just the very basic tools to be able to solder, 2 wires together, or 4 wires, or 8 wires, or whatever. But basic wire soldering. All right. We'll see you next time. I don't know why I'm whispering. Boom.
Get to posting those videos, oh yeah.
There. All right.